Be'ez Hashem Yisboch, we begin Perek Shishi, the 6th chapter in the Hilchos Shechitah, in the laws of slaughtering, in the Rambam Sefer Kedushin, in the book of sanctity, which we continue the theme of the previous Perek regarding discussing specifically the laws as they apply to treifa regarding a mortal defect, which the Rambam said there are 8 types, primary categories, which we are up to the next category, that of Nuku, which, as the Rambam opens up in Halacha Aleph, regarding what are the organs that their perforation, their hole, would be even a minute amount. As Rambam explains, Nuku, regarding this tarfus of being perforated, of having a hole, Ketzad, how's that so? So says the Rambam, Achat Aseh Varmhem, there are 11 organs, Shem Nikav Achat Mem Lechalol B'Mashu, that if there's a hole that goes through into the cavity, even though a minute amount, treifa, it's already considered as a treifa. Ve'elehem, and they are as follows. Tarbitz Haveshet, which is the entrance to the food pipe, the gullet, which we explained actually in Perek Gimel, Halacha Test, that the veshet itself that has a hole, that makes it into nevela. Here we're only discussing that which makes it in treifa, so it's specifically discussing the tarbitz haveshet, which is the top part, the entrance to the food pipe. Ukrum shel moich harosh, and the membrane of the brain in the skull, in the head. V'halev im hakana shaloi, the heart with its large arteries. V'hamara, and the gallbladder. And uknei hakoved, and the arteries of the liver, v'akeva, and the maw, v'hakoris, and the stomach, v'hamesis, and the abdomen, which that's a place at the end of the stomach, which is connected to the next one that we're going to discuss, the beis hakaisis, which that's where the food goes out from, goes to the beis hakaisis, to the keva, and from the keva to the daken. And the beis hakaisis, and regarding the gut, which is the end of the stomach, which is made like a cup, like a hat, which its walls are thick, like or goes around like 2 walls. That's why it gets its name beis hakaisis, like a kais. Badakin, and the intestines. V'hareya im hakana shalah, and the lungs with its bronchia. Those are the 11 organs that if they have a hole, even just a minute amount, into its cavity, it's going to become a treifa. Now, the Rambam goes through and goes through in detail regarding these 11 types of nukuvos. As Rambam says, Halacha Beis, regarding the tarbitz haveshet that he opened up with, says Rambam, tarbitz haveshet, this entrance to the food pipe, kvar b'yarnu shiura, already explained its measurement in the first paragraph in Halacha Vav. V'shehu hamokim min haveshet, now it's the area of the gullet sheina ro l'shchita l'mala min haveshet. It's not fit to do this ordering over there, which is it's above, it's on the height of the food pipe. That's what we're saying, that if there's a hole going into this cavity, even in minute amount, treifa is going to be a treifa. Going on to the next one that we mentioned regarding the membrane of the brain. So in Halacha Gimel, the Rambam says, Shnei krumos yesh lamoich shabrash. There's actually 2 membranes for the brain in the skull. Im nikav ha'elyon hasamach la'etzim bilvad. So if the upper membrane, which is closer to the skull bone, only that one got perforated, saris and mataras, still going to be permitted. It's not a treifa. Again, the treifa is a mortal defect. That means that the animal can't survive. It could have only the upper membrane was perforated. Now, if the lower membrane, which is nearer to the brain, if that one got punctured, treifa is going to be a treifa. Now, that's on the brain itself. Now, when the brain starts sloping downwards towards the spinal cord, and that's beyond the, so to speak, the beans, but it's the glands which are the beginning of the neck, because as the Gemara tells us, like there's 2 types of beans, which it just like has the shape of a bean, which are like on the opening of the pot, which Rashi explains, that's where the neck connects to the skull. So it's like you have the bone of that the brain is inside of, that's like a pot, that's like the skull. And on the opening, there's like these 2 beans, which again are these 2 glands. So if beyond those glands, which is the beginning of the neck, if at that point, yila krumi din acher, there actually the membrane has a different halacha, because that's the spinal cord, and there actually it only becomes a treifa only if a majority of it was cut, and not if it has a hole, which I'm going to explain later on in Perek Tes. Now, if let's say it's a hole outside of the glands, then mutter, then it's going to be permitted. Ram, like we said, again, it's going to have a different halacha than that it has of the membrane of the brain itself. Halacha dal says Ram, hamoich atz mishenikav. If the brain itself has a hole, ein nismaich was crushed, vakrum kaim, and yet the membrane is still intact, it's going to be kasha. Now, the nishbach kamayim, but if let's say it got crushed, the brain to the point that it pours like water, or it melts like wax, then treifa, then obviously the animal cannot survive like that, and it's going to be considered as a treifa. Halachei, the Rambam goes on to the next one that we mentioned from the 11, which was regarding the heart. Says the Rambam, halev shenikiv lebes chalali, if the heart was punctured into its inner cavity. So bein lachal gadosh b'smo, we know the heart has a few ventricles. So whether it's the large cavity on the left side, bein lachal gadosh b'smo, whether the smaller side on the right side, either way, if it has a hole through to its cavity, treifa, it's going to be a treifa. Now, but if let's say the flesh of the heart was perforated, but it doesn't go into the cavity of the heart itself, then what is going to be permitted? Now, ukenei halev, so the little translation is the rod of the heart, which are mizik hagadol. It's the large arteries that goes out from it to the lungs. Harei kalev, that has the halacha like the heart, and therefore if it has a hole to the cavity in a minute amount, treifa can be a treifa. Halacha above, the Rambam continues with the next item that we mentioned regarding the mara shenikva, regarding the gallbladder that was perforated. The chavit saisma, now the liver, which is right near it, if it closes it plugs it up, so it's going to be permitted because that's right where they're near one to the other, and it plugs up the hole, so it's not going to cause a rupture in the whole system of the animal that to make it die. Now, if the hole was not closed up, then even though it's near the liver, treifa is going to be treifa because ultimately it didn't close it up. Halacha zayin. Let's say nazia shenimtzes b'mar. Let's say there was a kernel that was found in the gallbladder. So, if it was like a seed of a date, which the top is not pointy, so it's going to be permitted. But if the top is pointy like an olive seed, asur, then it's forbidden. Why? Then obviously we presume that it perforated when it entered in. I mean, the other one, obviously it got in there some other way, but it didn't make a hole because it's not pointy enough. This one's pointy, so we're going to presume that how to get into the gallbladder, it made a hole when it went in. And visually, you're on like an eye, we don't see a hole. Because there's a scab that got over that of the wound where it entered, and you just can't tell. But we would presume then that kernel, if it's pointy like an olive seed, like an olive pit, that then it would be considered treifa. Now, halacha ches, the Rambam continues with the next item which we mentioned, which was the arteries, the knei hakovid, the arteries of the liver. It says the Rambam, knei hakovid, the hema mizrakim shabai, and again, like the mizrak is the term of the artery which throws the blood. Shebehem adam is bashal, which that's where the blood actually develops. So imnikav achen mehem b'mashub. So one of them was perforated in minute amount. Treifa, it's going to be a treifa. L'fikach therefore. Machat shenimtzes bechituch hakovid. If you find a needle in chituch, which it means it starts getting cut off, meaning there's the big chunk of the liver, and then there's the lobes. So in the place where there's the lobes of the liver, so if it was a large needle, and the pointy edge was pointed inward, meaning to the cavity of the animal, not towards the opening of the artery. So you do it, then you know, so that's how it came in, and that's how it's going down. It made a hole as it entered, making it into a treifa. Now, but if let's say the rounded end was towards the inside, so then we say that it can't come in through the rounded part. So how did it come in? Not that it made a hole, rather derech simfainis halcha, that it rather came in through the blood vessels, umutaris, and therefore it's permitted because it came in through some other way, not necessarily through puncturing a hole, and therefore it's going to be permitted. Halacha tes. Let's say it was a small needle, well then how is it a treifa? Then either way, even if it's the rounded edge that's facing inward, it's going to be a treifa. And the reason is, when something very small, even the rounded edge is really like a pointy thing, and most definitely we presume that it perforated as it came in. Now, but let's say you find it in the large blood vessel that's in the liver, and this is the large blood vessel that's in the middle, that's how the food, very likely the blood, gets into the liver, well then then it's going to be permitted, because again it's in the circulatory system. It's not something that we're presuming that it punctured. Now, ubesar kovet she'esliya, and regarding the if the flesh of the liver became wormy, that's also going to be permitted. I'm not concerned that maybe there's holes in the bronchi. Now, in Halacha Yud, the Rambam continues regarding now with the digestive system of the animal. Says the Rambam, Kevish and Nikva, regarding the maw that was perforated. Now, v'chelev tahor soizim es hanekev. Now you have pure fats that are closing up the hole, meaning there's different types of fats in an animal, and the fats of the kosher fats, they are much stickier. They're able to close up a hole, in contrast to the chelev that's we call the forbidden fats, which in this area is like it's bent, it's like that of an arrow instead of the straight part. So if you have the kosher fats that's closing up the hole, so then it's going to be permitted because it sticks tight and it's really going to close up the hole. So to any hole in the flesh or in the fats that's permitted to be eaten, if it closes it up, meaning any hole that is meat, this flesh, or kosher fats that are closing it up, it's going to be permitted because it's going to plug up the hole. Except for the fats by the heart, and the membrane that's on the whole heart, and the wall that's in the middle of the abdomen, which is the diaphragm, that separates between the digestive organs and the respiratory organs. The hisha koinais, and that's the muscle that you tear it, that you'll be able to see the lungs if you tear that out. This is what's called tarpesh hakavod. The way it's called is the membrane above the liver. And so that's we're saying is also going to be an exception to this law. And also the white part that's inside the liver, and also the fats of the last of the stomach, of the digestive system, which is the colon. Regarding these organs, there the fats are not going to protect because those fats are hard. And if there's a hole that's being blocked by one of these that we spoke about, the diaphragm, and regarding the chelev of the lave, and all those other ones that we mentioned, there it's not going to be considered as plugged up. And the chelev chaya, the fats of a wild animal, also that corollary by a domestic animal is forbidden, because chelev is only forbidden by behemoths, not by chayas. But those same fats by the behemoth are also, so they're also by the chaya, ain't a size if it doesn't close it up. Where although you're allowed to eat a wild animal, it's not about kosher or not kosher, it's about the function of those fats, and those same fats do not close up the hole by chaya too. Halacha Rav says the Rambam, karish and nikav, regarding the stomach that was perforated. So treifa, we'll continue on this list of the 11 items. So treifa is considered treifa. And there's nothing that can close it up. Because the fats that's on it are the forbidden ones, which again we said doesn't stick, doesn't close up so well. And v'chena meses, continuing on to the abdomen, ubesakosis, the other one that's shaped like cups. Shenikav achamem lachotz, where if one of them has a hole going to the outside, so treifa, it's a treifa. Now, in contrast, v'mnikav achamem l'teichal chaber, because here you have the digestive system, they run one into the other. And if one of them has a hole going into the other one near it, then which is going to be permitted because the other one is protecting on it. So although it's going into the other one, but that one's it's covering over it. Halachid beis. Machat shenimtzes ba'ovi beis hakosis. If there was a needle that was found in the thickness of the beis hakosis, which, as we mentioned before, that is doubled over in its wall, and if a needle is stuck in the thickness, because it's very thick, so therefore could be didn't perforate the whole thing. So mitzad echad, if it's only on one side, so the share it's going to be kosher because it didn't puncture all the way through. But if it has a hole running through and through, into the cavity of the beis hakosis, nimtzes tibas dam become a neck when you find a drop of blood in the place of where the hole is. So obviously that treifa, it's going to be a treifa shabbat couldn't shechitah nikv because most definitely it was perforated before it was slaughtered. Now, but if let's say this, although you see the hole through and through, but there's no blood where the hole is, or is a mud that's going to be permitted. Why? Because most definitely, if an animal's alive, there's blood that usually comes out. When an animal's dead, there's no more blood. So most definitely, after it was slaughtered, somehow through the pressure, the needle was pushed through and punctured all the way through. But really, when it was alive, it wasn't. So therefore, when it was slaughtered, it actually was kosher, and therefore would not be considered as a treifa. Halacha Yud Gimel. Behema shall ita davar sheniki b'nima el. If an animal swallowed something that could puncture its digestive tracts, could go in, for example, kairit shel chiltis, the root of this chiltis, which is very pointy, by things like that. So treifa makes the animal into treifa. Most definitely we have to presume that it punctured the intestines. Now, let's say you're not sure if something made a hole or didn't make a hole. So you do an inspection and you check to see if the animal has a hole or not. Now, kol echad mimnei hama'ayim, any one of the digestive tracts, that the waste matter, which is called the excretory system, the waste matter goes through them. They call darkened the intestines. Shenikiv, if there's a hole, treifa, it's considered as a treifa. Now, there are those that are curved in mukafim and they're surrounded one within the other, like a circle, like a snake that's coiled up. They're called hadar dekanta. That's the small intestines. If one of them gets punctured to the other one, meaning there's a hole from one to the other where it doesn't go all the way to the outside, because the other one that surrounds it is protecting over it and thus not causing the animal any toxic buildup. Now regarding the digestive organs that had a hole, and then you have this like mucus that plugs it up, because that plug is not going to last. Now, let's say let's say the intestines, that let's say a wolf or a dog, or a similar type of creature came in the Talmud and took them. Now, you find a hole after the animal finally let go of them. Well, then you suspend it on that it was the animal that made the hole in it, and it's permitted. We don't say, maybe that when it stuck its teeth and it took it away and it made a hole, maybe the hole was there already before and it made a hole where there was a hole, you don't have to suspect it. Now, let's say let's say you find holes in the digestive organs. You don't know if the holes were there before it was slaughtered or after it was slaughtered. So what you do is, you make another hole in that organ and you compare it. If that first hole was like the new hole that you made, then it's kosher because obviously it's evident that it has the same appearance as the types of holes that come after Shechitah. But if there's a differentiation, well then then we suspect that the hole was there before it's slaughtered, or treifa can be considered as a treifa. Now, but let's say it was handled by people's hands, and the one that has the doubtful hole, well then you also have to handle and touch the hole of the new one that you're comparing to it, and only then should you compare the two of them, because obviously by handling would itself possibly cause a change to the color, and therefore you have to do all the different elements to compare the variables. Says Rambam, let's say what happens if the intestines of an animal actually came out, but there's no holes. Mutar is going to be permitted. But if let's say they became inverted, the top parts of its intestines actually are in the bottom now, and the bottom became on the top. Then even if there's no holes, treifa animal is considered treifa. Why? It's impossible for the intestines to go back to where they usually were after it already became inverted. An animal's not going to survive, it's not going to live, because the digestive tract has to be exactly as Hashem made it. Halach design. Says the Rambam, the last of the digestive organs, which is straight, and there's nothing that's twisted. And that's where the waste matter leaves from the genital organs, all the way in the rear. And it's attached between the primary parts of the thigh. And that's what's called chalchailas, which is the colon. The reason why it's called chalchailas from the word of machalchel, where that's where the waste matter rolls out from. Now, if that has a hole just even minute amount, it's going to be a treva, kshama'im, like all the other digestive organs. Now, when do we say this? Shenikiv lechalal habetin, said if it has a hole going into the cavity of the stomach. But let's say it's a hole where it's attached to the thighs, because you have the thighs of the animal there holding it right there by the rear, then actually then it's going to be permitted because the thighs hold it in place. Even though there's a hole, the bones over there are holding it. And says the Rambam, even if actually the whole area of where it's connected to the thighs were removed, which has to be permitted. Because again, it's held there and placed by the thigh bones. Now, but as long as as long as it's left over from the length of by an ox, like 4 finger breadth, as long as that amount left, it's still considered as if it's intact, and therefore it wouldn't be a treifa. Now, the Rambam moves on to regarding the digestive system. It applies to oif, to fowl. It says the Rambam, oif, the bird, ain't like karas. So it doesn't have a stomach, doesn't have the abdomen, doesn't have the gut, it doesn't have these types of these 4 stomachs and the ruminants. But it has in its corollary it has by the bird zefek, crop, which is a pouch where the food gathers over there, and bekukavan and the crow, which is similar to that. Now, regarding the laws of tarfas, it's all the same by behemoths, chayes, oifis. Now, bezefek shenikev gaga b'mashu. Now, regarding the crop, that if it has a small hole in its roof, treif, it's going to be considered a treif. And says the Rambam, zehu gaga shal zefek, what's considered the roof of the crop? Zeshi matach im haveshet. This is what gets stretched out with the food pipe, with the gullet, kishiyarach oif tzabari, when the bird stretches out its neck. That, if what gets stretched out with that, that's considered the roof of the crop. Now, avashar zevek shenika, but the rest of the crop that gets a hole, it's only the roof which is integral that will be considered treif if there's a hole. Now, Allah says the Rambam, shnei kisen yesh ba kukavan. There's two membranes that there are by the craw. You have hachitz in the outer one, which is red, kamay basa like flesh. V'panim in lavin kam iron. You have the inner one that's white, like skin. Nikiv zebelezeh, if one without the other became perforated, which has permitted achinak v'shnei b'mashu until both of them have a hole, this even just a minute amount. Now, but v'mik v'shnei is zesh and naked zeh. But if let's say there's holes in both, but not one opposite the other, then mut is permitted because again, nothing is getting through; it's being blocked by the other one. Halacha Yetez Ram continues regarding the tchol, regarding the spleen. Says the Ram hatchoil, the spleen. This was not included in the list of the 11, where if the hole's minute amount. And therefore the sages didn't consider that and count the spleen in its categories. Rather, because actually the halachas of a hole in the spleen has measurements which is not it's not universal by the spleen. As Ram says, how so? Hatchol, the spleen, one end is thick, the other side is thin, the way the shape of the tongue is, which is thick on one side and narrow on the other side. So it depends. If the thick side has a hole that's running through and through, then treifa, it's considered treifa. But let's say it's a hole that doesn't run through and through, so it depends. If it's left over on the bottom, at least the thickness of how much you have, like by a golden dinner, then what is permitted. But pachas bakan, even though it's not through and through, but if it's less than that, then it's like it's through and through essentially, and it's going to be considered as a treifa. Now, but if let's say the thin side has a hole, then sure, that's going to be kosher. It's not as integral as the thick side, and therefore that's why it's not said in the 11 types, because it depends where and what is the hole, what the halacha is going to be regarding the spleen. Now, halacha chav the Rambam moves on to not missing, not a hole, but actually an extra part of the organ. As Rambam says, kol by any organ that the sage has said, shemnika b'mashu treifa, which we mentioned a list of 11 things that if there's a hole, this, even the minute amount, it's going to be treifa. Kachem nital kuli treifa. So first of all, if also the whole thing is removed, not just the hole, it's also going to be considered treifa. And whether it was removed through illness, or biyad, or by hand, or whether it's created lacking, will have the same halacha. Now, but the same thing is actually if it was created with two organs from that same organ, treifa would also be considered as a treifa. And the reason is shakala yeser kanatul chashav. Whatever's extra is actually like as if it was removed. So just like we're saying removed is a problem, just like it was perforated, so to an extra one, it's like it was removed. It has the same problems and it doesn't function as well, and therefore it's going to be considered lacking. This is from kids at how so. So let's say nitel echad minimum ayim. Let's say one of the digestive organs were removed, moro, the gallbladder, kids, or anything like that. Whether it's regarding fowl or whether regarding animals. So treifa, that's the halacha we were talking about. That missing it is the same as like having a hole. Now, the same thing is if let's say it has two gallbladders or two digestive tracts. Treifa, it's going to be considered treifa, and anything that's similar to that. Now, but if let's say the spleen was removed, or you find two spleens, which says permitted, like we said, it's not part of that list of the 11, and because it has different halachas, so it doesn't have the same halacha of, like we said, kaliyesik kanoplu, and even if it's removed, it doesn't have the same halacha as if it has the hole, which depending on where it has the hole in the spleen is going to have a different halacha, but it doesn't have this comparative of if it's taken away and if it has an extra one. Halacha chavav says the Rambam, hame'iha yeser. So the extra digestive organ, shetitarv by behema, which, like we said, makes the animal into a treifa. Hu hayeser mitchalas of atzayvis. Ram qualified. That's only if it was extra from the beginning till the end. Until it's like you find two digestive organs, one on the side of the other, from the beginning till the end, like you have like by the stomachs of the bird. or shahaya me'i yotzi ka'anav min abad, or if like this digestive organ was coming out like a branch from the trunk, but it's separate, and this would be a problem, whether by fowl or by animals. Now, but let's say if it comes back, then it's arvimei, so although it branched off, but it then comes back and it gets mixed in with the digestive tract. Vanasa echad becomes one. Mishneh Rasha from its two ends, so although it branched off, it comes back in. But varishnim of dom emsa, although they're separate in the middle, then actually harizim that would be permitted. Then it's not considered like an extra thing, because it actually just comes back in and it's part of that same system. So therefore, then they wouldn't have the halacha, and then actually it would be kosher.